let's see what to start with. There's so many. Let's start with 1NC quarters. Okay, I debated this at camp, and it's like a relatively fine 1NC, topicality, a contency, nothing crazy. Where I want to go to is really all the stuff on case. So, as you can imagine, if you're debating, you see this gigantic dump, and you're like, there's nothing to outplayer here, maybe an RBI, whatever, but usually you would have to respond to all of this. So the question becomes, how do you deal with all this stuff, especially in a short amount of time, parsing through all of this? This is where being comfortable with argument identification and with the arguments that are made is sort of important. So, really what's important is collapsing. That's probably the top level to all of this. In the 1AR, you have to collapse to one, maybe two framework justifications when you're dealing with big dumps. The way it'll usually be structured is they'll have a big framework overview. These will all be takeouts to util or maybe framework hijacks. They might throw in a little spice with something with an argument about permissibility. Essentially what they'll say is util fails, util cannot guide action because of infinite consequences, whatever. We'll go through that in a second. But the implication of that would mean that util triggers permissibility. And what that means is that util essentially fails as an ethical framework to the point where it would render any action permissible, and if any action is permissible, that means you vote af, neg, whatever. And so that's also a trick to keep in mind. So you would additionally have to say something like, permissibility is not a framework, reject permissibility because it justifies rape, or something else. To get to the, I guess I'll just jump into the framework stuff. So
what do you mean by reject permissibility because it justifies rape? Can you explain that a little more? So, I understand that if any action is permissible, then it would justify rape. But what I don't understand is why that relates back to you triggering permissibility.
So the argument is like you should reject the frame of permissibility itself. Like their argument that a framework could justify anything is an argument itself that should be rejected. It doesn't, like, their response will be, it's like a logical conclusion from your framework. This is like an independent, think of this as like an independent disadd to that framing, that things can lead to permissibility, or that permissibility should flip on any side.
Oh, like the concept of permissibility shouldn't exist because, like, yeah, you shouldn't rape someone no matter what moral framework you're operating under.
Yeah, that there are certain things that all frameworks reject, etc. And that voting neg on permissibility is not like a good model. So
could you also do like rule util?
I would not like act with rule util. They might say, well, our framework, like our standard, is the rule that maximizes things. And then you get into a framework hijack, which brings me to my first point. Act consequentialism collapses into rule. Yeah, sorry, Sophia. I think you're muted.
I was just going to make the same points. Continue.
Okay, so jumping into act consequentialism and rule, that's the first argument here. Act consequentialism justifies collapse into rule consequentialism. The exact argument here is just that we should use some rule in order to a rule that itself is utilitarian. Something like you shouldn't murder because murder is net non-utilitarian, and then just act by that rule. Since the problem with act consequentialism is that it requires calculating some infinite amount of consequences, or whatever problem it is. And essentially using a rule would help avoid some of those consequences. And what they argue is the collapse argument, which is it becomes the NC, whatever thing they propose, like Kant, Hobbes, whatever, is compatible with consequentialism or util in some way, that it functionally becomes a hijack. All the rule consequentialism stuff here and acts as a framework hijack. So there are a couple of ways you could respond to this. First, the NC does not maximize consequences. You could just point to the AF, like, look, this is a case where it disagrees with util, and the fact that their NC is different from utilitarianism proves that there has to be some disagreement point. And if we agree that utilitarianism is the frame for debate, you shouldn't go with some like cheap knockoff, just go with like act utilitarianism. Second is if you respond to their critiques of act consequentialism, like infinite consequences or whatever, then there's no reason to prefer the framework hijack. Util calc is impossible. broadly, there are a couple of broad sort of responses to framework indicts. This is a framework file. It's uploaded to the drive in the framework folder. But in general, actor specificity is just like a pretty good response to it. The idea that the government is utilitarian or has used util, which proves that it isn't necessarily impossible to aggregate consequences. It's an empirical example, but more broadly, you can say consequences may be hard to aggregate, but it's not impossible. Other things disprove, etc. Yeah, in Coach Lawrence's NCs, he has something here where it's like consequentialism is not hard. It's hard but not impossible. It's empirically false since we calculate all the time, and the alt is no action, which is worse. I think it might just be worth using this line because it's pretty efficient, and it's a really good overview to answer all these things like consequences, infinite aggregation, fails, induction fails, etc. More specifically, I think that if you want to be really efficient, you can just make that argument. If you want to get more in the weeds, consequences.
Wait, isn't it circular?
What do you mean?
Isn't it circular to say like induction doesn't fail because people use induction? Isn't that like saying like induction doesn't fail because empirics, which is like
well, their argument
circular?
about why induction fails is that we think induction works because of the principle of induction, which is a contradiction. I was going to get to this sooner, but the main arguments, in addition to saying like even if there is a theoretical problem with induction, the fact that it does end up working means that there's no real impact to it, and that's what the AT calc indites sort of get to. I think that's like you can contest the circularity too, but I think one of the most helpful things is just to say like just because induction does not work, like theoretically may have problems, does not refute its utility ultimately. Yeah, in the file there's responses to it. There are a couple here. We rely on past events, not past predictions, so there's no infinite regress. You can look at it, but if you want something quick, I would just say there's no impact to it because predictions have worked historically, and the only reason that this induction fails argument would matter is because it would take out predictions, which hasn't been true. Also, it just begs the question of probabilities, right? Like, yeah, there's some minute probability the sun won't rise in the future, but it's so low that we don't really take into account. And probability also applies to this second argument about infinite consequences. Yes, there are technically infinite consequences, but we can iteratively discount them by probability. So ultimately, at some point, probability reduces to 0 to the point where we can discount those. Aggregation fails. The cop-out, the easiest answer here is that even if util, like pleasure cannot be reduced to some measure like utils, we can use proxies like lives counts or like body counts to aggregate, especially when the question is about extinction. Even then, there are like ways to, like for example, Sinababu says that you can introspect about pain, and that's a way to talk about aggregation, even if it's like in the abstract you can't weigh these things. Recent first. Is this the middle realism?
Oh, don't read Sinababu, guys.
Oh, you shouldn't read Sinababu, but you can make
like,
the argument that he does make. Sinababu has been accused of like bad things.
Just don't.
Just don't read him. Say we don't like pain to say that we have a reason. Yeah, okay, this is like another collapse argument. It's like the reason we don't think pain, the reason we think pleasure or pain matters or don't matter is because of rationality. This is a reason why I would collapse to like Kantianism. The response here is to say that using the mind is not necessarily indicative of using rationality, i.e. there could be something so fundamental about pleasure and pain that it isn't necessarily that we have to use practical reasoning or something. And even if we do use reasoning, it's not evident that reason has to be its own moral framework, even if we use it as part of our ethical beliefs. And finally, you could say the only reason reason matters, or the benefits reason gives us like freedom matter, is because it terminates in some sort of optimal pleasure. Like freedom matters because we can do things that are pleasurable, etc., which flips this on its head. A priori knowledge first. So reasons for, there's an argument called action theory, which is like we take everything together, we take individual experiences or something together as one unified intent, and because of that, that's what ultimately leads to us being able to do action. It relies on that like idea of intent or like a priori reason. You can just respond to this by saying we don't need reason. We don't use reason in the philosophical sense of using humans as their ends in themselves to justify empiricism or to use empiricism for action. And that's more broadly an indictment of intent itself. So when you read reasons for why you should use consequentialism or not respond or not use intent, it responds to these sort of justifications. The necessary truth. So some philosophers distinguish between necessary and like not insufficient. I'm blanking on the justification, but there's a distinction between like a necessary obligation and an unnecessary obligation or an insufficient obligation. I think the argument here, and it talks about different worlds in which those are different. This relies on like a concept called modal realism, which is like we should consider all worlds, all possible worlds, and look to the best world. It's related to ideal theory. The short of it is that you should say like utilitarianism itself establishes necessary obligations, and the changing empirical circumstances change the structure of moral beliefs. Like it is morally relevant what circumstances there are because of the justifications for consequentialism. The next argument is like there's no reason why sensory data is trustworthy. You should say if sensory data doesn't matter, then none of ethics makes sense, especially because the reason itself is just an extension of our sensory data. Kant explains preference for happiness. You should say the opposite is true. The reason Kantian values like freedom matter is because of happiness. Happiness, according to hedonism, happiness is like a basic fact of our existence, which means it can't be reducible to anything else. Induction fails. We talked about that earlier. Act omission distinction. You should say that the act omission distinction. So the act omission distinction is the idea that we can distinguish me acting from something, like picking up this mouse, from me. It's different from me just not doing anything. The utilitarian would say that me not doing anything is still an act, right? An act of action to not do anything. And so even if the act omission distinction isn't true writ large, or is true writ large, it's not true specifically in the context of the government, because governments aggregate and are responsible for policies towards their citizens, which gives them sort of extended obligations relative to maybe an individual. Ultimately, what this relies on is like the infinite consequences argument, which you refuted above. But the really important thing is if you prove that there's no act omission distinction, then it means that all of your offense can be leveraged under the NC, because if omitting is the same as doing an act, then it means that omitting to vote affirmative, i.e. voting negative, omitting to do the plan, is the same as acting to create the harms of the 1AC, which is like extinction, which means that all of your harms, like death, etc., become offense under something like Kantianism, which would agree that death is bad. So it's a way. So if you do that judge instruction, it can help you leverage some of this stuff, some of your offense under their offense. So that took like 10 minutes. Obviously, you can't do that in debate round, which is why grouping is so important. So like group the 2, 3, and 7 points, no calc indites. You can answer some of the hijacks by saying pleasure is irreducible, util is, that structures everything else, which means our hijacks are a prior question, if that makes sense. That's just a general way to deal with all of these blips. Sinababu, some of these are blippy, so I can't really figure out what they're saying, but there's like this response of like the psychopath, which is like what happens if there's someone who likes pain or likes inflicting pain on other people. First, in response to all of these like broad like thought experiment type things, you should say that it doesn't really reflect like basic. It doesn't reflect the moral quandaries that we actually experience in real life, so it's not really productive. Second is that we value the ultimate pleasure that people experience, which means that, like, even if there are people that value pain, ultimately gets interpreted as pleasure, which means it doesn't really pose like a moral problem. And third is that, and most importantly, is that you can use things like body counts as a proxy for evaluating that, in which case it becomes self-evident that this doesn't really pose a question because we would minimize the amount of people that die. Waller.
What about, could you say that like psychopaths, if they're right that like psychopaths aren't capable of rationality, then that like takes out their arguments too?
Wait, psychopaths don't possess an amygdala. They're hyper capable of rationality. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think generally a lot of these like thought experiments also backfire in some frameworks. So like Sophia mentioned, right, the reason why someone would not pay attention to pleasure or pain would be like some sort of hyper rationality, like not being reined in by anything.
You can turn like things like the psychopath thought experiment. You can say that like the psychopath is an example of Kantianism. Without metrics of pleasure and pain, one cannot make good moral decisions. That's a very easy like turn.
Yeah, I mean that is definitely a great answer. I would definitely make that. The Waller is just an actor specification argument, so read actor spec here. These are pretty common. All ethics deal with trade-offs. You should agree there. All ethics do deal with trade-offs, but Util does is the best way of doing so, which is why it's most appropriate. Is ought. So people make the is ought fallacy, which is like just because something is the way it is does not mean that it ought to be that way. So just because the government does use util does not mean it ought to use util. The rest of the framework arguments do prove that it ought to, but you are making an argument for why, because of the government's like moral position, which is that of like this empowered agent, it ought to use utilitarianism. So it does disprove this is ought argument. Bostrom, I think some of these arguments are like not even that wrong. It's a reason why the Bostrom evidence is not that great in Phil. The top argument, it assumes consequentialism is like somewhat true. Bostrom doesn't really grapple with intent or other things, and so this is a reason why cards like Pummer are far better, in my opinion, for responding to it, because it pays lip service to other frameworks like virtue ethics and deontology, and says extinction still matters under those frameworks. No moral uncertainty if I win the framework debate. The point is, since we've read counterframeworks, there's always some risk of a moral uncertainty. Argument about why uncertainty increases, not necessarily. And if uncertainty increases, that's only a reason for why we should default to extinction. Aliens probably exist and configure ethics for us. This is not an argument. You can say whatever you want, like thumbs down, not a real argument, no proof aliens exist, whatever. Yeah, this was a lot. Again, this is a reason why you should be collapsing, right? Because to answer all of this, you don't have time, the 1 AR, and you have to respond to D, and you have to respond to the framework. So really important to collapse.
So what do you mean by, so how do you get rid of some of these arguments in both?
You want to group. You want to group and make sure arguments like no Calkindites, like pleasure is the most fundamental, so nothing can collapse. Stuff like that, and then just go for one of these arguments. So maybe you don't go for Bostrom, but go for actor spec, because that's a reason why it disproves Kantianism or whatever. Because each of your framework arguments are independent takeouts. That's the thing. So if you're in one reason why util is true, it answers Kantianism, and you just have to do weighing for why that comes first.
I would also be very careful though, because sometimes fallacies have a very strict layering where if you answer one argument or make one argument, then you can fall into a trap. For example, something I like to do when I read like some sort of fallacy, whether that be libertarianism or Rawls, is I like to kind of have a double bind where either utilitarianism justifies like terrible actions such as robbery, sexual assault, whatever, in the 1% chance of extinction, or it collapses to a rights-based framework because you'll extrapolate reasons why it doesn't justify that in a 1% chance of extinction. I feel like that gets some people caught up. So be prepared just to look at the layers of the framework debate.
Yeah, sometimes we can go over this in the trick section, but sometimes people will make skep triggers, etc. And so you have to be aware. Using cross-section and trick debates is especially important. I think we'll get to that soon. Yeah.
What does triggering skepticism mean?
So skepticism, moral skepticism, is the idea that there's no objective moral value or that we can't pinpoint moral obligations. The implication in debate, especially under truth testing, is that the resolution is like on face false and thus triggers presumption, because the resolution is a value question. If there are no, like, ought implies moral obligation. If there are no moral obligations, the F can never be true, so vote negative.
Skepticism is just the idea that no moral theory is true.
There's no morality. There's no objective morality that we can pinpoint.
Don't get it mixed up with something like pluralism, which means that there are multiple moralities.
Yeah.
Because you treat them differently.
What is skepticism?
Skepticism is just there's no objective morality. Imagine like
objective morality.
Objective morality is like God told us to do X, or reason compels us to do X, or some imaginary like obligation to increase pleasure says X. Skepticism might say those things are good, or those things have value, but it says that you do not have any duty or obligation or reason. It's basically permissibility. Yeah. It's like permissibility. Yeah.
Yeah, all the problems with permissibility apply to skepticism. It's like we cannot make moral judgments, and there are big flaws with that you should point out, and we'll get to that. But usually what people will do is they'll imply with some like wording that oh yeah, here, it's right here. If any moral code is not motivational, there's no reason to do what's right, and the code merely fails to escape the skeptical conclusion. That should jump out at you, because it means that what they're saying is if you respond to part of our framework, then no other moral framework makes sense, so everything collapses to skep, and then they just win on skep. So using cross-sex to be like, are there any skepticism triggers? If we respond to any argument, does it trigger moral skepticism, etc., is like very important. And then you should if they say yes, then you should preempt that. This is also why responding to truth testing is so important, because it just helps really leverage a lot of this and respond to all these dumb tricks. Going here to, again, the stuff on case. Induction fails, we talked about that earlier. Infinite consequences, we talked about that earlier. Retroactivity, this is like we only know what consequences have happened after it happened, so we can't use it to make future arguments. You should say predictions disprove that. Aggregation fails, we talked about that earlier. Morally abhorrent, Util doesn't justify slavery. There's so much pain that it caused that it was the opposite. The green card is like science proves util, or like psychology proves that people think in a utilitarian way. This is just like first argument is just why empiricism is like changes all the time. You should say that morality depends on empiricism, so it changes the contextual nature of moral obligations. It is not possible. This argument just misinterprets the evidence. It says that people interpret things in utilitarian ways. Impact justified, this is the same thing as presumes consequences. This is, again, a reason why Palmer doesn't really fall into that trap. Fallacy of origin, just because something is approved doesn't mean it's the starting point of ethics. Yeah, so just because like extinction is a prerequisite doesn't, like, I think this fallacy doesn't really make sense in the context, because it's not saying that all frameworks have to start from extinction, rather that it's like it's a weighing argument really for what would matter under any framework. Presumes death is bad. Death is definitely bad. Policy paralysis, you hit this in other arguments, in other contexts, like soft left contexts. Whatever general answer you make, like policy paralysis doesn't, like, we can weigh between different existential impacts with relative probabilities, or it's empirically denied, whatever, all those apply. Act omission distinction, talked about that earlier. Intent foresight distinction, this is sort of similar. It's like, if we foresee something will happen, like if I predict that if I like move my hand, it might hit myself, but I don't intend for that to happen, then that's like fine. You should be like, if we know something's going to happen, then it is like morally relevant and we can't ignore that. And I think it's pretty easy to respond to some of these subpoints, but I'll skip over them in time. Epistemic modesty, it's like this idea in general, whatever, this is being recorded. So epistemic modesty in general is the idea that, like, there are two different frames to evaluate moral debates. One is epistemic confidence, which is if you think whichever framework you think there's a greater risk of being true, you should only use that framework to evaluate morality. Epistemic modesty is you should like take the relative probability of a framework being true, multiply that by the magnitude of the violation under it. So however true Kant is in this debate, you should multiply the intensity of of the framework of like the contention under it, and evaluate that relative to the probability util is true times however big extinction is under it. I am like questionably a fan of epistemic modesty. I think a lot of frameworks say that any violation under it is infinite, which can collapse it, but you can read it. The arguments here are like fine. Like epistemic modesty relies on epistemic confidence. That's not true. It's a meta theory or a meta way to evaluate the framework debate. Irresolvable, like, yeah, you can't use exact probabilities, but how does a judge evaluate a debate anyways? You have to have some concept of that. This just misunderstands what epistemic modesty means. What next? All right, I guess we'll start getting into some more of the trick stuff. It's already lunch, so I guess feel free to leave because this is being recorded. But if you want to ask questions, then I think now would be the time. People still here? Yeah, okay. So, I guess first we'll go to this. This was like a big skepticism NC. They read truth testing, skep, and Nebelty. So quite an ensemble. Really important to collapses in all of these debates. I guess time permitting, I can just go over some of the common truth testing arguments. Or do you think I should save that for a different thing because we're already running sort of long?
You should make a sequel next time.
Yeah, okay, I guess we'll wrap it up there. Those were just some of the common framework answers. Important to group, important to recognize the synergy between some of those and to answer things like permissibility or presumption. Because like in this case, for example, in the skep NC, they had a bunch of reasons why permissibility negates, and then they made a bunch of like calc indites as a reason for why you should vote neg. So keep that all in mind. I guess we'll do a sequel later because this is getting pretty long, but yeah.